This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam, and I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people had so much to gain and had such a material motive to put me in a position I'm in. They'll never let the true facts come aboard to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader? Do you remember his name? You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
Now these people are in very high positions, Jack. Yes.
Good afternoon. You are tuned into a special presentation of the Warlocks of Palo Alto, The Grateful Dead as Mass Ritual, Part 1, Episode number 33 of Subliminal Jihad. Dimitri and Khalid launch into a kaleidoscopic, meandering, improvisational deep dive on The Grateful Dead. They look into the band's extensive links to the CIA MK Ultra LSD research at Stanford, Ken Kesey's acid tests, the deep folkloric origins of the Grateful Dead legend, Hank Harrison's anthropological framing of the dead amidst San Francisco's bohemian roots, and they begin to unpack the various counterculture figures and ruling class misfits hovering around the Deadhead scene. Here is Subliminal Jihad.
Episode 33. I am your co-host Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today, I think we just realized, a pretty monumental episode 33.
Yeah, didn't think about that beforehand, but it may be thematically appropriate. What isn't,
It might, yeah, exactly. Yeah. The tendrils of the Scottish Rite kind of stretch everywhere, and I think they do at least brush up against the topic that we're going to tackle today, which is one that I've definitely been excited about and have referenced, I think, going back to the earliest episodes. I think any discussion that we have on this podcast about Silicon Valley and Stanford and the San Francisco Bay Area and the 60s and LSD, it's almost impossible that sooner or later you are not going to run up against the jam band supergroup that I'm sure most of you know as the Grateful Dead. I went a little hard. I told Khalid I kind of went Bigfoot mode in my research for this because there are so many there's so many kaleidoscopic tangents that you can spin off from the Grateful Dead. So much so that we might have to split this episode into two parts, or I think definitely we'll revisit some of the dramatis personae that feature in this story at a later date, because they do have this habit of like popping up again and again and again in very strange.
We've definitely touched on them before, like Ken Kesey, Timothy Leary, like all these people. Terrence McKenna, they all come up endlessly. They're all very much like the Grateful Dead is like the archetypal sort of psyop like art project of like the weird like California MK complex. So,
yes.
And those are kind of like the salient like leading lights of that whole thing. So
they were, as we've said before, they were like literally the house band of the Palo Alto acid tests that were organized by Ken Kesey, like, which is to say, in at least an indirect sense, they were kind of the MK Ultra house band of the 60s. And as we'll explore in this episode, maybe that wasn't just in 1965. Maybe they ended up becoming the MK Ultra house band of all of American culture throughout the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and even till this day, where the Dead and Company, very lamely fronted by John Mayer, in my opinion, can still sell out shows at the Hollywood Bowl and travel around the country and play festivals and still bring an absolute army of the followers that are colloquially known as Deadheads to come and jam and vibe to their groovy tunes. But it's a really, so we're putting front and center basically our hypothesis that the Grateful Dead were
is it
some
even a
kind
hypothesis, like at this point? I feel like it's not. I feel like it's not hypothetical. It didn't even something that I feel like you copied this quote into our notes a couple of times, like bolded it. It was Jerry Garcia himself said, that he thought that it was a CIA plot, possibly.
Yes, he said, he told a journalist in 1973 after the European tour, and they took a hiatus, he said, quote, "For a long time I dragged my feet over total commitment, parentheses, to the Grateful Dead." Garcia told me in an interview I did with him in 1989. Quote, "For a while, I thought the Grateful Dead might be a CIA plot. For a long time, I vacillated." That's a pretty heavy. I can't think of too many other big bands from that era or afterwards, for that matter, that would entertain in an interview that they may have been a CIA plot and that it made them a little bit skittish about fully committing to, being in this band. Like, that's pretty rare. But I think right there, now I'm just going to imagine, I don't know, if people are listening to this and, they're regular listeners of Subliminal Jihad, I think they won't find this line of speculation all that surprising. But I'm just going to imagine, I'm hoping that maybe a few Deadheads will stumble upon this podcast. And I think we want them to feel seen, because I know that it's a very deep, emotional connection, almost a spiritual connection to the music of the Dead. And so one barrier to the mainstream acceptance of the idea that the Grateful Dead could have been a CIA plot is the almost para-religious devotion to the Dead by the Deadheads, because I think it's your rank and file fans, as opposed to maybe in other situations where it might be like journalists that are stepping in to do the interference. In this, it's like the whole vibe that the Grateful Dead cultivated is that they are basically, pun intended, like a bunch of merry pranksters that, don't take anything too seriously, man. And so, and Jerry Garcia was definitely sort of beloved for like his playful, pannish kind of, personality. And so they would say, oh, that's just Jerry being Jerry. He's just like kind of having a laugh and being a little bit hyperbolic because, the hippie scene in like San Francisco, around this time, they would say all kinds of far out things. And it doesn't mean you should, take him literally, that he's saying that, but I'm actually, I think maybe we should take him a little more literally. And,
yeah, like even in that documentary Long Strange Trip that I watched, to prepare for this, I really have no knowledge of the Grateful Dead, at all. So I really am, I guess I'm not a Deadhead, so maybe, if I were, a devoted fan, can't really put myself into the mentality of such a person, but I really knew very little. I still, I'm not an expert by any means necessarily. Prior to reading about this, I didn't really know too much for this episode, that is. But I watched that documentary on Amazon, Long Strange Trip, which, Amazon is not a counter signal, like, underground frequency, it's, like, right there. And, like, they pretty much, like, were relatively open about the fact that they were playing at Ken Kesey's acid tests, which were pretty much CIA sponsored. And they, they like even said in the documentary, like, ironically, like the CIA like did create, did turn on these people, like they, like inadvertently, I don't know about like the inadvertently thing, like unwittingly he trained a dolphin to,
that is also not the last time we'll bring up dolphins or Dr. John Lilly in this episode, but but
it's a whole web. They're all connected. They're all connected.
It is a whole web, and I think so. That's important to get out right away. Is that the information? So even in the canonical history of the Grateful Dead, that is 100% true. So we have to start from what we do know for a fact to have actually happened, which is that the Grateful Dead formed and played their first gigs. At this time, they were called the Warlocks. They changed their name because they found out that Lou Reed's band in New York, in Greenwich Village, was also called the Warlocks, which is another, kind of rock lore, kind of curious thing. But anyways, warlocks, magicians, etc. But their first shows where they came together, and more particularly where they moved, because they didn't start out as psychedelic rock musicians. They came out of a background that included like bluegrass and folk primarily. Jerry Garcia had become quite a virtuosic banjo player and was playing in basically like a jug band with Bob Weir and Pigpen and and Robert Hunter and a couple of these other main core members of the Grateful Dead. And it wasn't until they got a gig playing at Ken Kesey's acid parties in Palo Alto which were, basically the point of these acid test parties was to give out, free LSD basically to everybody, or everybody paid $1 and, went in and they had a big tub of like Kool-Aid, spiked with LSD in the middle, and, people could drink it. And then they would do all kinds of parties, and they would, have a house band, which, they were kind of hired, I think, to make kind of like blues rock music. But then, of course, they were taking the acid as well. And then the psychedelic, trippy blues rock kind of style of the Grateful Dead, like by their own admission, coalesced at playing these various acid parties in 1965. And people also, I'm sure Deadheads know this, but regular people aren't aware that the Grateful Dead was not a San Francisco rock band. They were perhaps the most notable, I wouldn't say only, but definitely the most famous Palo Alto rock band ever. And, given everything we know about the internet and Stanford and Silicon Valley, this is a Silicon Valley band. Like from these people grew up in Palo Alto and the surrounding cities. And, for anybody that isn't familiar with the Bay Area, it's a very kind of balkanized and decentralized kind of metropolitan area that's separated by this gigantic bay. And even though Palo Alto and Stanford are on the San Francisco peninsula, they're way down at the bottom, so they're probably about like 40 miles south of San Francisco or 30 miles south. It can be quite a long time with traffic. I'm sure there wasn't as much traffic back then, so you could kind of cruise around the bay, and car culture was very important to young people. So they would go up to San Francisco and come back. They were definitely part of this Bay Area kind of artistic milieu, broadly defined, but they were a Palo Alto band that started playing in bookstores and coffee shops in Palo Alto. So they were well primed to be in close proximity to a lot of the interesting research that was happening around that time at Stanford.
One of their big lyricists, John Perry Barlow, who worked with them and wrote one of their big political songs, or I think what's considered to be their most political song, "Throwing Stones." was like a real big like internet guy, like a cyber libertarian activist, and who was like super into the internet, who was in like The Well in 1986, which had like a bunch of Deadhead connections in general. Like there were a lot of Deadheads involved in it. And so they were super plugged in. to all of that from the start.
Yeah, and John Perry Barlow, like some people might be more familiar with him from his work related to internet stuff. I mean, it's usually a colorful thing on his resume that people bring up to be like, whoa, how cool, how trippy, man. He was a Grateful Dead lyricist, and then he got into Silicon Valley. As we'll dive in later with Barlow, he wrote an article in Forbes magazine in 1993 called Why Spy, that he was invited to Langley to basically help advise the CIA on how to build, how to basically set up like an interface with the internet, because he claims at his time that they were thinking old hat, man. You know, these guys were all squares. And he helped them set up their intranet, you know, their classified intranet thing, and also, you know, advised them to like set up their own website, which like blew their minds, bro. Wow. You know, and all this kind of stuff. But like you're reading between the lines of this article and you're like, well, okay, you are advising the CIA to build an intranet. You're so counterculture, bro.
He also was like, you know, best friends with Dick Cheney, and like tried to do a suicide attack in the 60s.
We'll get to it. There's so much of him. But anyways, like, I think.
the whole story around the fact that they have that they're called the Grateful Dead is that it was like random, like that they, some like randomly pointed to like Jerry Garcia, like randomly.
Yeah, Jerry Garcia and Phil Lesh were hanging out, and Phil Lesh like gave him a dictionary, and he opened it up to a random page, and it said the Grateful Dead, and they were like, "Oh my God, eureka, we found it."
And I don't even buy the idea. Like, for one, I take issue with, I think the whole story's fake and made up, and I don't think that it was random. And I also think that, like, it would not be in a dictionary. It would have to have been an encyclopedia. Like, no dictionary has Grateful Dead in it. Like, it's an obscure term. And what this term meant before, like, we would refer to basically like a classification of folktale. Involving basically someone who gives money to like for the burial of a dead person, and that dead person returns from the grave to help them in some way. Like maybe we'll read some of these Grateful Dead folktales if we have time, although I do doubt it. But it is a common folktale topos. Actually, like the Grateful Dead is like an Arn Thompson. We talked about the Arn Thompson classification system on the podcast before in our Giants episode. So I guess for those who are on Alara, the Arn Thompson classification is like the Grateful Dead, and this kind of topos. And, a lot of it I think is influenced by the fact that, even in his book, which I think that you mentioned, Hank Harrison's book, he talks kind of about how this is like he says, the seemingly strange values that exploded in the media in the mid-'60s in San Francisco were actually archaic traditions. The erroneously named flower children were actually gifted rebels who were cautiously applying ideologies derived from numerous utopian experiments. The medieval socialism of the Manichees and the Cathars blended well with Buddhism, the Kabbalah, and the Tarot. These traditions took hold in the mystical element, which can best be found rooted in a pre-colonial form of Freemasonry, a form opposed in every way to the anti-intellectualism of the white Anglo-Saxon. First of all, like, is that what is a pre-colonial form of Freemasonry, for one? And also, like, wasn't it white Anglo? I guess the Scottish Rite is like Celtic in theory, but I feel like Freemasonry has always had its proponents among white Anglo-Saxons, like from its earliest.
And if we want to get specific,
in the Freemasonic.
Yeah, like mostly slave owners and pro-Confederate people. Literally founded the Scottish Rite. It's founded by a Confederate general, so obviously it's expanded beyond that. But yeah, that is a very curious. I was kind of surprised to see the depth of. But I appreciate Hank Harrison's very occultish kind of contextualizing of the scene in which the Grateful Dead kind of came out of. And it should be mentioned that Hank Harrison is like an extremely interesting and sus character. He wrote a couple volumes of a kind of almost like a folkloric ethnography of the Grateful Dead, and he could do that because he knew a lot of these guys. He was the bassist Phil Lesh's roommate in 1960, I think down in maybe San Mateo, and then became friends with like the kind of Palo Alto music scene and Jerry Garcia in the early 60s, and he went on to become the first manager of the Warlocks before they became the Grateful Dead. But also, I think the big elephant in the room.
They were first the Warlocks and then became the Grateful Dead is like it's not like a random name that sound. I mean, it does have a certain like sensibility to it, like when you hear it, like it definitely is evocative, but
it's got a good ring to it.
It does have a good ring to it. It's memorable, but the fact that like the interaction. Anyway, sorry. I'll let you.
The one thing, because I think I think Hank Harrison's book, while I don't trust all of it, is kind of a good place to start to like set the scene, and maybe even the more like vague occulty dimensions. But like the one thing maybe a lot of people know about Hank Harrison, which is one of the many weird rabbit holes in this story, is that he is Courtney Love's father. And he's Courtney Love's father, and has actually written a book alleging that Courtney Love murdered Kurt Cobain. So they're not on good terms. But Courtney Love, in her own way, described, she grew up as a baby around the time that the Grateful Dead was like getting together, and I think lived in like a commune house with a lot of the members of the Grateful Dead when she was like a toddler. But then there's been all kinds of bizarre, allegations from like her mother, who I think was a poet from a wealthy New York family, that Hank Harrison would give Courtney Love LSD when she was a toddler and do things that kind of sounded like experiments, like put her in a playpen with like pit bulls and like give her LSD. So, just keep that in mind with Hank Harrison, that like this guy has he also admits to just abandoning Courtney and his wife, like when he decided to go manage the Grateful Dead, and just like abandon them in San Francisco. And like, so he's kind of not, not the, maybe the greatest guy, but he does seem to be very, very knowledgeable about like European paganism and Freemasonry and occultism. And I think he was getting his master's degree at San Francisco State around the time. So he had kind of an academic background. He also was in the Army. I've seen it said some places that he was an Army intelligence officer, probably in the either late 50s or early 60s. Not necessarily during the time he was doing this, but anyways, like...
However, like a lot of the time what passes for like scholarship like at San Francisco State like during that time like doesn't hold up like nowadays. And like I don't like necessarily like trust like his insight into this stuff. I certainly don't like buy the notion of like medieval socialism at all. I just think that that's like, one of those things where you retroactively project things into the past like that weren't like properly formulated like theoretically. And I also think that like, I don't know, I just feel like this hodgepodge of like medieval socialism, Buddhism, Kabbalah, the tarot, and the whole idea of a pre-colonial form of Freemasonry that's opposed to the anti-intellectualism of the white Anglo-Saxon. Like, I definitely think that despite the Scottish Rite being called the Scottish Rite, I feel like its origins are still with white Anglo-Saxons. Yeah, as you mentioned, like Albert Pike was like a big popularizer in the United States. Even before that, though, I think that it probably was like, I think that the reason why it's called the Scottish Rite is probably because of like some association with James 6 and 1, or James 2 and 7, I guess, is the one who's associated with it. But I don't know if like, I feel like that's still pretty Anglo ultimately. But yeah, like, but I do think that like the insight, like the core of it is correct in that like the relation to the people have with the dead, and even the association of deadheads themselves. I mean, there's two levels to it, because on one hand, like, they're deadheads, like, they're, there's a mental, like, they're mentally dead, like, they're tuned out in some way that, like, refers to the sort of psychedelic aspect of this. But I also think that, like, the relationship between the dead and the fans kind of mirrors, like, cults around the dead, like, from, a pre-modern context. Like, that I think that a lot of these, folk tales of the Grateful Dead kind of represent, if you pay into the system of the dead, you'll get something back. And that's something that, like, was a lot of the time cultivated through, like, cults around the tombs of saints or martyrs, something like that. And I think that that's kind of what, and a lot of the time living saints or, in different religious traditions sort of had a liminal quality where they were intercessors, like, among the dead, and they had the ability to communicate with the dead. Like, that's what made someone, like, a holy person. They had some kind of interaction with that. And I think that some of that aspect of, like, the fandom around the Grateful Dead is, like, sublimated or hidden or occulted in some way. But I think that the fact that that's the name, like, it has, like, a very clear resonance. And, like, the parallels, like, really, especially when they're drawn out deliberately in this way, more or less, by people like Hank Harrison, I think that, the resonance is definitely there. Like, this, and, with the skeleton, all their symbology, like, I think that this is something that's being tapped into for sure.
Yeah, and that's definitely the creative principles around the Grateful Dead project. I mean, we talked, I think, before about how Jerry Garcia was a huge fan of the Urantia book, And
he carried it around with him, and it's like, this figured it all out, man. Yeah, like this is the most important book I've ever read. Yeah,
and he was obsessed with kind of like occulty kind of things. Robert Hunter, who was the first and kind of probably the most dominant lyricist. This is a weird thing about the Grateful Dead, is that they had 2 in-house lyricists that didn't play any instruments but just wrote all the lyrics for them. And the lyrics, the amount of care that they put into their lyrics, which I mean are highly kind of romantic and like impressionistic, and they're not, I mean, this isn't like a Henley Fry level of quality that we're talking about here, or a Bob Dylan level of quality. This is like goofy allusions to mysterious things, but I think there is. I think it would be foolish of me to dismiss all these lyrics as just gobbledygook and kind of word salad, free association, hippy dippy LSD stuff, because Robert Hunter was like very fascinated with like Rosicrucianism and Eastern mysticism and things like that, and worked a lot of veiled references into their lyrics. So there's like an occulted kind of like Kenneth Anger's movies. There's something going on between the lines that evokes a feeling. And
although having watched that 1977 Grateful Dead movie that Jerry Garcia directed, like I would much rather watch like hours of Kenneth Anger than like watch that. Like I could not handle, like it was awful. But
if you want to get a first that is one, the song that opens the Grateful Dead movie, which is released in 1977, is one that we'll probably come back to, because it's a slightly later song of theirs, but US Blues, which I think kind of stands as the most sus lyrics of any Grateful Dead song, wherein Jerry Garcia, over a kind of like a goofy kind of carnivalesque blues beat, sings I'm Uncle Sam, that's who I am, been hiding out in a rock and roll band. And then he makes a bunch of sus references to like shaking the hand of P.T. Barnum, who's a Mason, and I stay 72 come rain or shine, like, give me 5, I'm still alive. I'll run your life. I'll share your wealth. I'll steal your wife. All these kind of things that I'm sure a tripped out Deadhead would just be like, yeah, man, like get off my back, Uncle Sam. Yeah, I'm just gonna like live my life. But I'm Uncle Sam. That's who I am. Been hiding out in a rock and roll band. And as we're about to see, that is maybe kind of a just revelation of the method. Kind of rubbing it in your face, perhaps, with a dancing Uncle Sam skeleton making like weird duck noises in a really creepy way, and like literally like an Illuminati pyramid with like a flaming eye like flying around in the cosmos.
And UFOs zapping everything. I mean, it's a little heavy-handed. Like they're laying it on pretty thick, but I do think that it's interesting. I mean, I thought of while I was watching it that sort of Thomas Jefferson quote about like how the land is like like the living are kind of entitled to the land, or the earth belongs in usufruct to the living, and the dead having neither rights nor powers over it. I guess that's an editorial note, but his quote is the land belongs in usufruct to the living, that the people who are alive have more control over the land, I find like the whole that's a fundamental kind of American idea that's very much baked into the history of America and the unfolding of the entire history of this country, and the idea of like this cult around the dead, which is something very fundamental to the way pre-modern societies were organized, and the sort of juxtaposition of that with America in the sort of very chaotic, psychedelic way. It's interesting because I feel like that's kind of the tension that's being wrestled with, like the absence of. I mean, I guess it's something that could be projected across the entire moment of the 60s, or maybe a moment that we're still sort of seeing unfold or experiencing the aftershocks of. But it's the grappling with this tension between like the absence of this kind of spiritual network or this sort of spiritual scaffolding in American society.
think with that, I want to read just a little passage from Hank Harrison's The Dead, where he talks about the name and kind of touches on a few things, but also gives you a general little historical kind of background for it, but makes a lot of spiritual or mystical allusions. So he writes, in 1965, a San Francisco rock and roll group took the name, The Grateful Dead. The name had a ring to it. It had shock value and a show business flair, but none of the group's leaders or friends had any idea that the name would evoke an immense genie, a flying eyeball, an energy cloud that would last for more than 2 decades. Over those 2 decades, the Grateful Dead became the single most popular unknown rock group in the world, a group known to everyone who broke the law, but to almost no one on the straight side. The social schism was very clear-cut, and the Grateful Dead became a symbol of solidarity against the Squares. A legend from a myth, they and the other San Francisco bands had inherited the holy grail of the 1950s. The hot rod music lived on. Their name grew shorter. From a title to a familiar name, now they were The Dead, every man's band en route to heaven or hell, or the maze at Chartres. The Dead and the other San Francisco bands in the 1960s were the first bands to do extensive live FM/AM simulcasting with television and live quadraphonic broadcasts. The Dead advanced recording technology and filed for patents on innovative recording devices. They also developed a wall of sound public address system that has never been surpassed. This is writing in the 80s. Each seat in any hall or any outside arena anywhere could be tuned for optimum acoustic accuracy. The Dead were one of the first to use advanced microprocessors in the music production system and the first to admit taking massive amounts of LSD. They started as a blues band, survived the erroneous acid rock label, and went beyond that rubric to be heralded as a seminal source of new music. All this went on while they simultaneously evolved into a huge tribal family and extended kinship group. Like most of the Northern California bands, the Dead developed their own style and their own instruments. The Dead had no single sound, but rather a continuing kaleidoscope of sounds and musical expressions from tuneful to symphonic, from harmonic to atonal, and from silent to very, very loud indeed. The Dead, as a family, were also an accurate microcosm of the large alternate culture around them, a subculture which continued to develop on into the 1980s and beyond, a subculture which eventually made everybody strive for individuation, misfits first, individuals later. I remember meeting each of the musicians in the Dead at critical points in their careers. Phil Lesh, the bass player, and I were roommates in 1960, and again from 1970 to 73. He was always called Professor. We absorbed Nietzsche and idolized the nihilist samurai, the East-West cowboy, Kurosawa's Samurai Knight as portrayed by Tishiro Mifune, the Green Knight of Arthurian legend. I met Jerry Garcia in San Carlos at the bookstall and at Kepler's bookstore down in Menlo Park back in 1961. Most of us were smoking grass in those days, and the police hated it. Garcia banjoed and sang bluegrass and folk songs with an auto harp wizard named Marshall Leitcher from Yale, and with Bob Hunter, who wrote most of the Grateful Dead lyrics. Garcia was seeking some pure dimension, but always a show business dimension too. Cynical, funny, serious. You see right there, I thought that was interesting. They were absorbing Nietzsche and idolizing the nihilist samurai, the East-West cowboy, which of course is like a huge influence on George Lucas, who Hank Harrison was also friends with, at least at some point in this this kind of era. And the hot rod culture as well. I think he talks a lot about the hot rod culture and the biker culture in the Bay Area in the 50s going into the 60s. And while he doesn't mention him by name, he's obviously talking about, he's obviously kind of referencing the culture of like Scorpio Rising and Custom Car Commandos, which were the films, Kenneth Anger made in San Francisco in the early 60s, which Hank Harrison even admits had a certain white supremacist vibe to them often, but were a huge part, Harrison writes elsewhere about like hot rodding and just the he writes about like the sexual liberation and how it was connected to the development of cars and freeways. He says sexual liberation required mobility in mild winter weather. In order to go nude on a public beach, one needed sunshine and a car. California provided both elements free of charge. All you had to do was steal the car. The two ingredients were simply not available on the eastern seaboard, at least not in the late 1950s. The motorcycle and hot rod became major status symbols in the California youth culture. The lead sled became the dream car, and sexuality was, to use a Quaker term, bundled with the new mobility. Daddy's car was not as significant as one's own short, and the ownership of a car represented a passage right. Thus, independence meant fixing up a clunker of one's own. The ownership of the pink slip was the main material goal. The idea of going to a bank for a car loan was sheer lunacy. Going to the bank meant asking the paternal society for help, thus admitting defeat, selling out. With proud individualism, the children of the late 50s, both male and female, were the first generation of Americans to walk the gauntlet from puberty to young adulthood with a set of car keys in one hand and some form of birth control in the other. The beat of rhythm and blues, known as doo-wop on the East Coast, was the background for dancing and dating, as well as serious discussions about chopping, sectioning, and channeling a car, punching a mill and controlling the geometry of a rake or California tilt. The ingenuity of hot rodding came from good old-fashioned Yankee ingenuity with some midnight auto shopping thrown in. When money was short, most resourceful lads were able to procure gasoline with a rubber hose, known in California as an Okie credit card. This may have been a regression to hunter-gatherer activity, but it was a form of freedom. Irreverence for the public superego was leading, in the eyes of the parents, who were more often full of sexual envy, to the decay of normal socialization. The elders saw sexuality as a threat. They could no longer sell or control their daughters and could not select a bloodline for their grandchildren. The actors in the sexual drama saw it another way. They saw sex as a valuable educational experience. Clearly a new form of political liberation was on the horizon. Was it? In the early 60s, the car cult and surfer irreverence began to mix with jazz values and folk music. The beatnik of a slightly earlier generation set the pace. Nonconformist cliques, often rounded in a high school context, continued on long after graduation. In the Oakland-San Francisco area, the display of individual worth, the symbolic status of any given participant, was put on parade in two interwoven rituals, the cruise and the drags. The cruise in the East Bay was ethnically mixed and went along East 14th Street to Oakland to Hayward, easy a 50-mile round trip. The white shoe cruise, essentially the white-collar subculture, went up and down Geary Boulevard in the neutral territory between Lincoln and Washington high schools. And the voice of Laughing Sal, he notes, on the beach, a frightening mechanical figure in the funhouse added surreal air to the assembly. So he's just saying, they would drive all up and down the peninsula. They'd go to what is now Silicon Valley, along the El Camino Real, which he translates as the road to reality, which is kind of apparently, according to Tennessee Williams, he called it the road to reality. It's supposed to mean the royal road, but okay. And so everybody cruised on El Camino and Palo Alto. This ritual set the stage for the drama to come. Both millionaires and winos were built on the values absorbed in those cruising car rituals. On Friday nights, the cars became offices. The back seats were turned into love stations on wheels. Dropouts and future rock stars went through the same initiations. He said these were like the new extended families, this sort of art-based culture. He says, they've now, the rock group and the art cabals and the crews of post-adolescent San Francisco represent at least two generations of tradition. The hot rod culture is now extended to every western state and most eastern states where a modicum of affluence can be attained. And, he notes white-suited East Coast writers might affect canes and smug attitudes, looking at you, Tom Wolfe, as they wrote about candy apple paint. I think he is talking about Tom Wolfe, actually. As they wrote about candy apple paint jobs, but they could never have understood what it was like to spray the stuff on, rub it down under a cool freeway overpass, and cruise it down the road. Visitors from the East Coast would never have thought the whole scene fantastic, and could never have understood the meaning of the shibboleth, "If it don't go, chrome it." The once forbidden rock and roll was played as background to virtually every activity. The same radio stations united the many night haulers. AM radio was it. KYA was popular in 1957 and stayed popular right up until FM took over. But soul stations like KWBR and KSAN, both now long gone as soul stations, were always available at the push of a button. And here's where, in the still of the night was real. The lyrics even made sense sometimes. Ooshooby-dooey-doo-wah, a party was always happening. Beatniks came to these parties and the crossover was starting. Those who were avid readers and numerous musicians left the cruise for the esoteric sanctuary of a loft party in North Beach. The attractiveness of intellectual stimulation in a non-academic environment could not be ignored. News of the cognoscenti and rumors of wild parties above and beyond the hot rod scene came filtering down. Soon everyone wanted to be a, quote, beatnik. The intellectual side of the brain, and a great deal of social alienation association developed rapidly as beatniks like Ginsberg and Ken Kesey and Jack Kerouac influenced this new tribe of baby beatniks. Virtually everyone who wound up contributing to the Haight-Ashbury experience was touched directly or indirectly by the car and motorcycle culture. Almost everybody wanted to belong to something other than their genetic family. The rock band, the art cabal, the car club, or the folk and jazz ensemble became the extended family so desperately sought by the rejected and often gifted nonconformists, especially in the Bay Area. As the decades turned, the conservatism of the parental generation conflicted with the advancing dream of personal freedom held by the young people. One custom car commando was overheard saying, "If they didn't want us to be free, they shouldn't have taught us about it in the 8th grade." I like that.
Yeah. It's
so
interesting.
Just to really finish here, because this will bring us right up to the acid test and like the vibes. After 63, the fully integrated extended family grew rapidly. In many cases, ties to the birth family were strained. The dropouts became black sheep. There was pain in this. The parents were judging the outcast by old values. Some even believed their children were becoming communists. They were, of course, and this is important, quite wrong. The new movement was an expression of freedoms as American as the hot rods that mobilized it. By 1964, the Kennedy assassination, the music of the Beatles, the Stones, and Bob Dylan merged with the advent of psychotropic drugs and the integration of black values. The genetic strings of the white middle class snapped completely. Certain utopian ideas, even some Marxism, remained always in the background of the San Francisco lifestyle, but basically the mass movement away from middle-class values was timely and inevitable. These systems provided guidelines for the young people as they made the transition from traditional societies to alienated, antagonistic, politically dangerous, free-thinking subcultures. Once the transition was made, they came flooding into the Haight-Ashbury and North Beach from the suburbs and from small country towns all over the nation in search of companionship and cheap or even free rent. At first they came in slowly, and then, as the media made a show of it, the tidal wave hit. It is a tribute, and this is interesting from my own personal experience, it's a tribute to the state of California that the study of the proud traditions of the missions and the westward settlers were mandatory in every school and college, second only to United States history. Thus, every potential commune had at least one leader who had a rough idea of California utopian traditions that go back to the Elizabethan discovery of New Albion by Sir Francis Drake and to the fulfillment of the prophecies of the Franciscans who, while thinking of establishing a new Jerusalem in California, likened the state to an Islamic caliphate, a paradise on earth.
Yes, although I think that the name California was indirectly inspired by the idea of a caliphate, but I think
interesting.
But it was like from a novel or something.
Okay.
There's a mythical island of California in the fictional story of Queen Calafia, but that name probably was kind of inspired by the actual term Khilafah, that we know so well from ISIS, most people know well from ISIS. If you're Muslim, apologies, because you probably know it from a more legitimate source. But if you're not, then you probably heard about it in dark, scary tones from Graham Wood. But
of course. Also the teaching about the missions. I mean, I went to Catholic school, so maybe that it makes sense I would learn about the missions. But we in 4th grade, you had to do a whole thing about the California mission system, and I think you had to pick a mission, maybe go to one that was nearby. There's still a bunch around, and then write a book report on it and things like that. So that does kind of hit accurately that. Because you didn't learn about the California missions. You probably learned about the Puritans or something.
We learned about Long Island history. We learned about how we're supposed to say Long Island and not Long Island. But I don't know if that worked. Anyway.
So everyone had this kicking around in their brain from going to school in California. These were all California natives, so not transplants, and I guess it merged with the hot rod culture, and of course the lurking force in the background of all of this is the military industrial complex in the California aerospace industry, which is a huge provider of jobs jobs and economic activity in the Bay Area and Southern California throughout the 50s and 60s. And, as we speculated before with Kenneth Anger, this kind of fetishization, the eroticization of cars and motorcycles, and then, the fact that his dad was an engineer working on airplanes. There's an interesting subliminal kind of thing going on with California culture where it's obsessed with these like rocketing powerful machines, the children of rocket engineers were juicing up hot rods at the same time they were trying to build ICBMs and fighter jets, right?
Yeah. I mean, the more you talk about this, the more I feel like it might actually be interesting to read, like, some of these, like Song Dynasty, like, Buddhist liturgies, especially with Hank Harrison's, like, allusions to, like, for one, I find it so bizarre to say, like, samurai or nihilist. I guess that's probably because, like, in death poetry, like, samurai are, like, tend to, or maybe they try to cultivate as part of, like, Bushido, some kind of, like, general, like, dispassion about their own death, but I definitely don't think that means they are nihilists in the conventional sense of, like, moral nihilism or something like that. I think that's, like, kind of, I don't know, maybe the idea of the samurai as a cowboy, like, maybe Clint Eastwood is kind of nihilist, maybe in A Fistful of Dollars. I mean, in a way, sort of like an arch capitalist, but yeah, the more, like, and the sort of the allusion to, like, 8th grade and, like, it does make me think about the relevance of these, these systems and the idea of, like, the binary of, like, the living and the dead, and the passage you read about the sort of contraction of the Grateful Dead to just the dead. Just to cite that quote from earlier, it's from a letter from Thomas Jefferson to James Madison. I think that this part is interesting. He says, "The question whether one generation of men has a right to bind another seems never to have been started either on this or our side of the water. Yet it is a question of such consequence as not only to merit decision, but place also among the fundamental principles of every government. The course of reflection in which we are immersed here on the elementary principles of society has presented this question to my mind, and that no such obligation can be so transmitted, I think, very capable of proof. I set out upon this ground, which I suppose to be self-evident," like very much echoing the way he talks in the Declaration of Independence. Yeah, he says, that the earth belongs in usufruct to the living, that the dead have neither powers nor rights over it, as said before. But this is, very much in contrast to, like, the, I think about G.K. Chesterton, who we mentioned, like, in our Ouija episode that we just did for Elwara, where he said, like, tradition is the democracy of the dead, that, like, in this sort of vulgar idea of tradition. But there is, like, sort of definitely a sensibility in pre-modern societies that, like, the idea that the land only belongs to the people who are currently alive, and that people who are dead have no, like, rights or entitlements, like, that is, like, outrageous, like, from, like, a pre-modern point of view. When you're engaging with things like, Arthurian lore or whatever, like, when you encounter this stuff, like, it's going to be very much at odds with that idea. I think that, like, this actually is kind of interesting in line with the idea of the Grateful Dead, and you'll see, like, the resonances. I think it's a little bit off the beaten path. I think it, like, has, like, a good SJ place in it. It does have to do with, like, liturgy and actually music, and that's, like, interesting. So I'm just going to read from this Edward L. Davis, Society and the Supernatural and Song China, which came out in 2001. Again, I apologize for not being able to pronounce any Chinese words. If I say them, like, I probably am saying them wrong, but it's just, I don't know how to say them. But I do find the content to be interesting. So he says, "The most popular rites for the dead in the Song Dynasty were the Buddhist retreat, Buddhism, retreat of water and land, and the Taoist retreat of the Yellow Register. Both liturgies had their origin in the 10th century, but their textual elaboration and social diffusion must be seen as a product of the 12th and 13th. I include a detailed historical and structural analysis of these ritual complexes in the appendix. Among other things, this analysis reveals that the retreats of water and land and of the Yellow Register were converging during this period of textual elaboration and social diffusion. Both liturgies had come to share a similar tripartite structure that included 1. The construction and purification of a ritual space, 2. The summoning of the gods, saints, and souls of the dead, including ancestors and hungry ghosts, into the ritual area, 3, rites for their deliverance. In the all-important central panel of this liturgical triptych, the panel that forms the implicit frame for much of the analysis in this chapter, the convergence of the two liturgies was even more exact. Both included rites for destroying the earth prisons, for opening the roads from purgatory, for releasing souls from sin or ignorance, for bringing souls into the ritual area, for washing, dressing, and feeding them, and finally for subjecting the souls of the dead to transformation and or conversion. So
that sounds like a Grateful Dead concert.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just using this as an example of something that like you could find parallel, like, you know, insofar as you can find parallels between this and like the phenomenon of the Grateful Dead, like in American culture, you could find parallels between that and like similar phenomena in other cultures. You know, again, like I generally caution against like pertaining with too broad a brush in terms of talking about vastances of time and space and like, you know, cross cultural divides, but insofar as this has some resonances, you can see this in like many cultures, including like Anglo-Saxon ones with like Feast for the Dead and that type of thing. But anyway,
and this like is Dia de los Muertos, obviously. Has even a lot of aesthetic comparisons to Grateful Dead iconography.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's very much influenced by that. Yeah, iconography.
And this culture actually,
called, but
Hank Harrison goes into how the sort of cruising and sort of car gang culture and the hot rod culture that did have a large Latin influence from, you know, the Latinos living in the Mission in San Francisco. And, you know, they would beef a lot, but also the kind of like zoot suit gangs. And I forget I think it was maybe Pachuco. Oh, yeah, Pachuco. Yeah, exactly. The Pachuco Cross, I guess, which was something that was adopted by the Hells Angels. And then like Pachuco culture, which is kind of similar to kind of zoot suit culture in the 50s, but that had a lot of influence too. I don't know. It also, the Pachuco insignia was also compared by Hank Harrison to the heads of the Cobra as represented in 1975 by the flag of the Symbionese Liberation Army. So that was kind of floating around and stuff.
Right, yeah, there was, that reminds me of the Franklin episode that we did where Michael Kesey claimed to be in contact with Patty Hearst.
Yes, exactly.
But this is just like an anecdote of like one of these ceremonies, which I think is, you know, this will be the end of this part. But you know, I think this is fruitful perhaps. Okay, so he writes, this is Edward L. Davis, and he's going to use an anecdote about a Yellow Register retreat. He says, almost all the accounts of Buddhist and Taoist mortuary ritual concern in the Zhanzi, which I guess is the text, in one way or another, they concern, in one way or another, the appearance of the dead. Their appearance, normally but not exclusively in visions and in dreams, captured the imagination of Hong Mai's informants more than any other aspect of these rituals, and it can be surmised that it did so precisely because this aspect, again more than any other, best expressed for them what the rituals were all about. The dead were wont to appear as often at a Buddhist retreat for the spirits of water and land as at a Taoist Yellow Register retreat. In the case of the Buddhist ceremony, however, befitting Buddhism universalist claims, the dead would often appear as a group, which is like just amazing, as often as they would appear individually, whereas in the Taoist ceremony, even if it were open to all, the dead would appear only individually. The following anecdote may be taken as representative of the Yellow Register retreat, on which I will now focus. We won't read his focus, but we'll read the anecdote. On the 16th day of the second month of 1198, a Yellow Register offering was held in Taiqing Abbey in Rao Prefecture. It was offered for people who wanted to summon the dead. For each person, it cost 1,200 copper cash. Almost 1,000 people participated in the ceremony. Just at the end of the ceremony, the merchant Fu San saw his mother, who had recently died. She was wearing the clothes that she wore when she was alive. She was drenched from top to bottom and had come from afar. She entered the ritual area. Watching this was so painful that Fu couldn't bear it. He cried bitterly and immediately returned home. His mother gradually followed him home. Their conversation was just as in earlier days. She said, "Because of the effort of your paying the money at the sacrifice, my voice is the same as when I was alive." This is the essence of the idea of the quote Grateful Dead. You gave me this money.
Okay.
Fu wanted to ask in detail about what had happened to her, but she disappeared suddenly. The daughter of the eye doctor, Wei Shang, was married to Zhao Si. In the first month, she had died because of something related to producing milk. She also participated on the altar. When the priest summoned her, Zhu saw her distinctly. Her body was covered in white clothes. She walked through water in bare feet. He could still hear the sound of the water. After she appeared before him, both her feet were still wet. Suddenly, fear came over him. He hurriedly left his wife and returned home. His wife also chased after him. Zhao hid in the bathroom, and his wife entered the kitchen. Zhu observed that his wife's facial expression was like when she was alive. He became even more frightened. He ran to his room and immediately took off his clothes and went to bed. His wife also slept by his side. She left at dawn. So,
wow.
They,
eerie.
Yes, very, very eerie. And a lot of the time the living, like, they try to flee the dead, and, the dead are actually there. There's, like, a realness to them. And it's not just, like, visions or hallucinations, but at the same time, like, the sort of sense of appearance, there's something similar going on. I think that these, like, concerns, in a way, like, are suppressed and resonate. I feel like this is an interesting connection that's a little bit off the beaten path, but something to contemplate. Something that at least strikes a chord with me in terms of some of these themes. Perhaps like in a little bit more like rigorous way than some of the links that Harrison is drawing. But I think that the fact that these connections would occur to him, suggests like the same.
referential, like, literary aspect of a lot of the things around the Grateful Dead and everything from their song titles to their visual iconography to also the things that Ken Kesey was doing. And Ken Kesey, had gone to the Stegner creative writing program at Stanford, which is where he wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And so he was trained in this I believe Stegner was one of the programs that had sort of CIA connections during the Cold War with the entire sort of MFA industrial complex that started in Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how he ended up in Palo Alto. But I noticed something interesting here, and I think I'll just start because Hank Harrison he points this out when he's doing a little backstory on San Francisco itself. So he says about kind of the absolute roots of San Francisco. Like New Orleans in the South and New York in the Northeast, San Francisco has always had a bohemian subculture, always the heart, brain, and sexual center of Alta California. San Francisco started out on a rude sexual note. In the beginning, on July 4th, 1776, there wasn't any. The Franciscan Padres, who established Mission Dolores in that year, were celibate. The miners, ship captains, and claim jumpers who came later just stayed lonesome. Gold sparkled in every eye, but there were no women. In fact, San Francisco built its first sidewalk for loose women who, although disreputable in Boston, were queens in the tent city of 1852. This reality has never changed. Whores built the town, whores ran the town, civilized the town, and have always done so in an uninterrupted chain of command from the days of mud ruts and sunken cargo ships. Any native San Franciscan would be proud to trace his or her matrilineal successor to a night lady and an unknown silk-covered digger who paid for the grand moment in gold dust. Most of the pioneers deny this, but the statistics tell the tale. Whores and hobos, gamblers, robber barons, and, quote, girls posing as refined schoolmarms and princesses. That's what Frisco's built from. Due to its precarious origins, San Francisco has always been a home for bohemians. Robert Frost was born in San Francisco, as was Isadora Duncan and Alex B. Toklas, Gertrude Stein, and Ambrose Bierce, the kinky consciousness of the West. Far prior to the time of Miss Stein and Company, San Francisco was the home of scoundrels and fashion-plated overnight millionaires, all of whom lived in the cracks between the fears of earthquakes, poisonings, theft, arson, rape, and all manner of unthinkable crimes. And then he quotes either a poem or a song here that says, "The miners came in 49, the whores in 51, and so between the two of them there came the native son." So he talks about drugs. Where all things like hemp, cocaine, opium, and hooch have always played a major role in San Francisco lifestyle, and the inheritance of the bohemian tradition from Europe and the Orient is direct and undiluted. California's literary traditions, from such as Jack London and Robinson Jeffers and Henry Miller, speak clearly of the continuity of high-class beatniks now called rich hippies, and San Francisco's history is full of Emperor Norton eccentrics, more so per capita than any other place. But San Francisco's history is not just a gold mine history, not just a 24-karat meat pile. It's more varied, uneven, indefinable, inconsistent. Even the Elizabethan origin, the landing of Sir Francis Drake, remains a mystery. So the thing with that is that, that's very true, that San Francisco, I think we talked in episode 2 about the Crockers and then about like Michael Aquino. I wonder if Michael Aquino could trace his lineage back to a lady of the night in San Francisco, if it goes back that far on his mother's side. But, that kind of whole milieu. But what was interesting about that, it jumped out at me, and actually I hadn't been aware of this, but the term acid test that Ken Kesey used, it turns out that he was kind of doing a nice little literary twist there, because what that was referencing was the acid test that was used by gold miners in the 1850s, which was a method of using a strong acid to separate gold from base metals. And then that term became figurative after a while and became, considered any definitive test for some attribute, like of a person's character or the performance of a product. So that's a really interesting way to contextualize Ken Kesey's acid test as both a hearkening back to the gold rush that basically founded San Francisco as we know it, and had such a huge role in, the drawing people to this, like moths to a flame, seeking wealth and riches and et cetera, and also a kind of harrowing experience that would reveal kind of your true character. So, I guess I'll give him credit for a very loaded term in setting up these. But it reminded me of how the Grateful Dead stuff harkens back to these more medieval rituals about summoning the dead and all that stuff. How they're reaching back further into the past to rebel against the present, I suppose you could say, to rebel against the democracy of the dead, I suppose.
Yeah, or I guess like they're trying to establish like a democracy of the dead, or or something to that effect. I mean, again, like these like dialectics like usually like are very fraught, and they don't like fully operate like, and the tension between like the living and the dead, like the the old and the new, like the whole generational conflict. Like a lot of the time, I feel like these binaries kind of break down, like and there's always like some kind of space in like the interstices that disrupts them in some way. And like I don't know, I feel like the paradigm, obviously, like when you consider like all of the like practical connections like to like intelligence agencies and things like that, the whole like paradigm of like this like rebellion that was like bubbling to like burst out kind of breaks down like the whole idea of like this utopian thrust into the future. Like again, like after a certain point, like the whole idea of like, oh, this is something that's moving towards the future, like, and is future looking or utopian, versus this is something that's in some way conservative or looking like towards the past.
Yes. Which is fascinating to think of when you considerably, because I think there always was a kind of association, certainly when I was growing up, that the Grateful Dead, at the very least, I mean, they were hippies. They were kind of nonconformist. They didn't really want to, get in with like straight society. But all that stuff coded to me as more or less kind of more on the left than on the right, like more liberal, more revolutionary, more radical. But then you would notice things, and you do see some interesting people pop up, like in the Long Strange Tip documentary, the most funny of which is Tucker Carlson, who I think I've definitely mentioned before is like a huge fan of the Grateful Dead. And, to think that this sort of bow tie wearing young Republican frat boy could vibe with what the Grateful Dead was selling, at first glance kind of seems a little weird. But then when you dig a little bit deeper into the real kind of ethos and even their apolitical stance, which, I think categorically I can say is like bullshit. Like no kind of music is like purely apolitical, but certainly not any kind of music that is making such a show out of rebelling against conformity and, trying to, challenge the norms of society. Like, how could it not be? But, they always copped out a little bit. And then you would see groups that, like the Hells Angels, like floating around them, and people like John Perry Barlow, who literally ran Dick Cheney's congressional campaign in the 1980s, and I think mostly considered himself a Republican, was maybe until Obama. Was a huge booster
for Dick Cheney. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And like a fervent Republican, and yeah, absolutely.
And as we're gonna see, like a lot of these hangers-ons, like came from a deep kind of old. Came from deep power, political power and money in Wyoming. He was the grandson of like a Mormon pioneer and very wealthy rancher who I think became a state representative, and had this his family had a 22,000 acre ranch in Wyoming, and he went to an elite all boys boarding school where he became friends with Bob Weir, who was also a rich kid. He was adopted by Frederick Weir, who is a wealthy engineer in the Bay Area. And they grew up in Atherton, which I think still to this day is like where all the Google CEOs live and is maybe the wealthiest zip code in America. And he was also sent to the I forget the name of it right now. I have it written down somewhere, but they became friends at this like elite boarding school. So, I mean, you start to see maybe some of these people kind of floating around, and their politics do start to get a little more vague. And, you know, you realize that, I mean, I would say, I don't know if you could categorize like what their political philosophy kind of became. It was either kind of like check out of politics and like it all sucks and don't care about any of it, which I think was kind of more Jerry Garcia's position on it. He was kind of, you know, he at least was a principled hippie and not engaging with it at all, as opposed to some of the other Grateful Dead people who like endorsed Obama and like, you know, just became like libs, like rich libs after a while. But, you know, it's, I don't know if you would call it like even left libertarian, but I would say, you know, libertarian. So on that count, they are kind of, I take them at their word when they talk about how, you know, really like there is no band more American than the Grateful Dead. Like I would, and you know, of course, the way it's positioned in 60s culture is that's a big victory because these Eisenhower era squares claim to be the real Americans, but nah, man, like we're the real Americans. But it's still kind of not that fundamentally different at the end of the day. It's just like you're kind of the cowboy settler colonialist of the mind, I guess, of the lifestyle. You know, you're like a cultural pioneer, but you have the same kind of manifest destiny mentality, and you're not really challenging the kind of economic, social, political structures in which, you know, that govern all of our lives. You're carving out your own little safe space where you can just kind of do drugs and like party and have a good time, which is, that's bigger than the Grateful Dead. I mean, it's like so many different kind of genres, whether you think of like EDM festivals or like Coachella or things like that. I think a lot of these things have been mainstreamed and kind of used. And in that sense, they are a very kind of interesting Silicon Valley innovator because, and maybe we have to like kind of on one level look at them like that as a Silicon Valley project, because they're so tied in with the development of the internet and all of this electronic technology. I mean, even Hank Harrison says they filed patents. They had some of the most advanced like audio technology of the time and pioneered in media. You know, I mean, they pioneered a lot of like new media stuff and were very tight on like a personal level with a lot of Silicon Valley people. And there were a lot of Deadheads in Silicon Valley, which makes sense because that's literally where, you know, they came from. And there's just, you know, there's a lot there.
I mean, they're the ultimate case study in the fact that, like, you know, saying, like, this music's not for sale is, like, the ultimate, is, like, a marketing slogan, you know, and the whole ethos of the Grateful Dead, like, even the Grateful Dead themselves, like, the idea that, I mean, that's, like, at a certain point in time, perhaps there was a significant contingent of squares who were in some way, like, threatened by the existence of this band, but I think that, like, to say that this was in any way, like, I don't know, like, I feel like this is the application of these forces in the, like, you know, service of not really, like, or directed change in some way, maybe.
Yes,
or,
exactly.
Like, I don't necessarily think that, like, you know, there's a lot of, like, contradictions inherent, like, in the image of that stuff, I think. And I think that the occult stuff, the symbology, like that helps like these contradictions to be in some way like stabilized or reconciled or to not be interrogated, because like a lot of the time, you know, that sort of liminal quality, that like both andness is part of that world of like the dead and the crossover between the dead and the living. You know, and I guess that does have a connection that we've drawn many times with the virtuality of the internet.
Exactly. And also towards like the quote unquote new left, which they were kind of in and out of interacting with, because obviously there was a radical political scene in, you know, the 60s and like the Bay Area. It was the locus of, I think it was the most active region for FBI COINTELPRO activity and surveillance and harassment and all these things. And you did have a lot of like radical people, but just another weird thing that I noticed was like back and forth when Hank Harrison, he becomes the manager of the Grateful Dead in 1965, like I think either right before the acid tests start, but after they've sort of formed and become like the Warlocks. Like, he mentions that, you know, he was bouncing around. Like the year before the Warlocks were formed, he had been studying psychology at San Francisco State, and kind of going to what you said, he was kind of proud that most of the graduate students there were somehow attempting to replace Watsonian behaviorism with ethological science. The idea was to supplant Pavlov's dog with Lily's dolphins. So he was getting into this kind of woo-woo territory. But then this is a weird connection. During the 1964 season, the year before the Warlocks were formed, I, Hank Harrison, was recruited by the great Saul Alinsky to help organize shop-ins. And so he was like, he was mentored by Saul Alinsky, who, you know, we could, you know, folks, like, you know, or do like Glenn Beck voice. And
what is a shop-in? Sorry, okay. I guess demonstrators went to a store posing as customers, pile a basket or trolley high with groceries, take them to the checkout, and then refuse to pay, leaving the goods piled to checkout. Wow. Okay, I see.
Yeah, and then, you know, after he came back to I think we can stitch together, because Harrison's narrative is like a little bizarre, but the way he more or less tells it. Okay, so during 1964, he went and was organizing under Saul Alinsky, who has been accused of, I was just reading separately, like in the last week or two, that, you know, kind of a early like color revolution kind of pioneer, like fake left sort of whatever. Obviously, you know, I think the connections between like Obama or Hillary with like Saul Alinsky would speak more to the fact that they're probably CIA than that they're like secretly Maoists. Saul Alinsky was like a lib. He was not a Marxist organizer. Just, you know, make that clear. But he spent about a year gone from the Bay Area. But then when he came back, for 4 months in 1965, he had returned with, he had just returned from the Millbrook estate, where Timothy Leary was hanging out after, you know, the Mellon family had given him this mansion up in, wasn't it in Millbrook, New York? You know, in upstate New York, where he was running the If Foundation that we mentioned previously with Richard Alpert / Ram Dass. And he had brought back with him like a bag full of LSD spiked sugar cubes that he then started to distribute to members of then the Warlocks and other people around like the Palo Alto music scene, and started taking it himself. And then after, I guess he managed the Warlocks for about 4 months in 1965. Then he went back to Chicago to visit Alinsky at the Industrial Areas Foundation, which just sounds, I don't know, sus. Sounds... I don't know. Yeah, it's the largest network of local faith and community-based organizations that was founded by Saul Alinsky, Roman Catholic Bishop Bernard James Scheel, and businessman and founder of the Chicago Times, Marshall Field III, who I guess was a big fan of Saul Alinsky and a big backer of his. I think his one of his sons does something now, but yeah, they basically owned the Chicago Sun, were like controlled the newspapers in Chicago, very plugged in. Anyways, so that's a little weird, and he doesn't. Not that I've seen in the book, he doesn't really explain like how he ended up at the If Foundation, hanging out with Tim Leary and getting a bunch of LSD to bring back to Palo Alto and spread it to people, and then goes back to working for Saul Alinsky. Like, we're already seeing just like a very dizzying, like strange assortment of individuals doing work with each other in 1964 and 65, you know, before the LSD revolution had really started to blow out. And then I guess shortly after that, the acid tests begin at the end of 1965. I think the first one, there's even disagreement on like who was at the first acid test, which ones were the first. And I guess at the first one, 27th of November in Soquel, California, at Ken Babbs's house on, I guess, he recalls it as Halloween night. And they did. There's a mystery around whether or not the Warlocks played. There was a flyer that showed up, but then other people have said that this flyer is forged, and there's like witnesses that say that they didn't play, but they were there hanging out with like some of the merry pranksters. And I guess December 4th in San Jose, where weirdly they were playing at a house like a block or two away from where the Rolling Stones were playing that night. They made their first performance as the Grateful Dead. And then there were, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There were like 15 to 20 acid tests. The very last one, which was billed as a graduation, in March 1967. And because, of course, on October 6th, 1966, LSD was made illegal. So all this stuff up to this point was not necessarily breaking the law. You know, there's all kinds of things with the acid test. One thing that does stand out to me is in the few articles that I looked up talking about them, nobody will give a straight answer on where the LSD came from. Now, Hank Harrison mentions bringing acid from Millbrook, to give out to certain people, but I don't know if he had the quantities available or if he was around the whole time to source more of it. This was also, I think, before. I think there's some confusion over another interesting individual, Augustus Owsley Stanley III, who became known as the Acid King and was the sound engineer for the Grateful Dead. And I guess sometimes it's said that he manufactured the LSD for the acid tests, but he says his first shipment of LSD arrived on March 30th, 1965, and he produced 300,000 hits, 270 micrograms each, which is honestly a lot. That's a heavy dose for one hit. By May 1965, then he returned to the Bay Area. Okay, so Wikipedia, with no citation here, says in September 1965, Stanley became the primary LSD supplier to Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. By this time, Sandow's LSD was hard to come by, and Owsley acid had become the new standard. And, he was manufacturing, LSD at that point. But then I found in another interview where I think it was Ken Babbs, who, allegedly hosted the first acid party. He says in this one interview that I found that contrary to popular belief, the pranksters didn't provide the acid. Ken Babbs explains, just because we used LSD doesn't mean we were promoting its use. LSD is a dangerous drug if taken lightly. If one must be of sound mind and body and have good touchstones in life. If not, they will fall by the wayside muttering and mumbling like a ravaged mind sucked by Venusians, which is a way, I guess, of breaking down conformist ideology. Ugh, yikes. Okay, so they're saying they didn't provide it, but they're obviously kind of playing a little bit fast and loose with some of the facts there. And I saw, and there was another interview, I'm trying to find where it was, where somebody gets very kind of uptight when they ask them about that Halloween party that was near where the Rolling Stones were playing, and they said, nobody ever wants to talk about where the acid came from, and nobody's going to answer that question. So I guess everyone's very tight-lipped about where that acid came from. And so since we know that Allen Ginsberg, Ken Kesey, Robert Hunter, and possibly Jerry Garcia, but definitely those three, were all official MK Ultra volunteers taking psychedelic drugs at Stanford University. I believe in 1962 and 63 were the years that they were doing that, but they all went through and got turned on directly by the LSD. Now, Hank Harrison says that when he brought back all those cubes from the Millbrook estate, that he had taken one the night that he went to see Jerry Garcia play, and they hung out, and he gave the acid to some other people, but he didn't give it to Jerry yet. But then a few weeks later, Jerry took it for the first time, and this is supposed to be in 1965, but if Jerry Garcia was taking it in MK Ultra context in 1963, this is where things start to get incredibly sus and weird and start to break down, because, who is the driving force behind, these acid parties? Was it really just a groovy idea that Ken Kesey had? And then he paints his school bus and runs off around the country with Neil Cassidy, the real-life inspiration for Dean Moriarty from Kerouac's On the Road, very much in the mode of, like what you said, like a living saint. I mean, this is like a celebrity to like beatnik type people, and they go around doing all kinds of weird pranks and secretly dosing people with LSD all over the place, and also doing weird things like going to Arizona and doing like an ironic campaign rally for Barry Goldwater in 1964. Oh yeah, I forgot. This is actually before they did the Merry Pranksters thing in 1964, and then they came back and then they did the acid test. But really makes you wonder, like, what the hell Ken Kesey was kind of up to. You know, I mean, he did have some money from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and which I just watched the other day. Yeah. Actually, a good movie. I mean, I wanted to be sure in case I really talk shit about him being just like a CIA gobbledygook, but it is quite moving. I did weep a little bit at the end when Chief runs away, stuff like it is kind of, and but it's interesting that book was directly inspired by him working at the Palo Alto Veterans Hospital, and also inspired by his LSD experiments with MK Ultra, and kind of the lengths that the medical establishment would go to like lobotomize you or control you and all these things. I think maybe the reason that book is good, as opposed to like all of his later work, which nobody kind of the consensus is like not as interesting, is because he was getting at something that was real, that the sort of the biopolitical control of the individual in American society, and the use of drugs and prison and things like that to psychologically control people and make them conform. I think that was all salient. It's just that I think maybe Kesey seems to me like a classic cultural Cold War limited hangout artist. Exposing something true that is fucked up about American culture at the time, but then offering a pseudo solution, which is, as Tim Leary would coin it, turn on, tune in, drop out, get freaky, be a prankster, never, tell the truth or be serious. Take a cover yourself in a cloak of irony, make cum jokes, sit on a hot couch, etc. Sorry. I
definitely think that there was some degree of, I wouldn't necessarily draw a hard line between the acid tests and the his MK Ultra LSD experiments. In fact, I think that what was his name, Hunter? Was it Robert Hunter? Yeah, Robert Hunter was also first took LSD in an MK Ultra type context, on the
they all did it in the same. So, I think it was the same sub-project trial at Stanford that they all did.
I definitely think that everything that was they were literally acid tests, I'm certain at this point, and I think that it's almost to the extent that it's at all a secret, it's a pretty open one. That there was. Well,
but of course the limited hangout that's been spread by everybody from Tim Leary to John Lennon and everybody else in between is that this is the ultimate bumbling empire kind of blowback.
So ironic, exactly. Whoa, big, the CIA really blew it because they accidentally created this radical rebellious social movement which
is a really I mean that's a convincing thing for a lot of people to grab onto, because it still syncs up with and validates all of the 60s countercultural history that we all get kind of taught.
That makes them even cooler because they subverted the CIA, which I don't really think is the case. Maybe they're not everything was meticulously planned, but I think that the whole idea was that there would be sort of running with this and experimentation involved. I don't think that maybe there wasn't a plan that everything went according to, but I don't think that necessarily by that fact itself, I don't think that means that some kind of plan was subverted I think that
absolutely,
the plan was that it would be experimental, and that this was something that was desired.
And that is something that definitely, I think it was a memo that Tom O'Neill uncovered in his Chaos book, which does, it's more about the LA scene, which that'll probably be chapter 2 in whatever we call this series, what was going on down in Laurel Canyon at the time. But he did find a memo from, I believe it was Louis Jolyon West writing to Sidney Gottlieb, the head of MK Ultra, that mentions a kind of a cryptic line about the controlled experiments they were doing with LSD, but that naturally, he was writing in the early 60s, he said naturally we're going to have to take this research out in the field eventually. And I think this is after Midnight Climax, which also was in the heart of the beat scene up in North Beach in San Francisco in the 50s. But it's after they had already taken it out in very limited ways or given it to certain intelligentsia. Now, so I think maybe what he's alluding to was we need to actually take it out into maybe the Merry Prankster thing had some kind of connection with that, being a Johnny Appleseed running around to different cities and just handing it out like candy. And then these acid tests are let's bring in young students, anybody that wants to volunteer, and let's test this under social situations and see what I believe. I can't find the thing right now, but I'd read, they experimented at the acid test with kind of different kind of rooms sometimes where or they would split the room in two where kind of like a rave you would go to later on. Somebody does make the connection that this is kind of where raves came from, at least in a modern sense. But they, in one room, it would be like an A/B testing thing where maybe they would have a more chill, Zen kind of spiritualistic room where everyone was taking acid and chanting Om together and doing this kind of real hippy dippy stuff. Then there was the psychological kind of overload room where Grateful Dead was jamming out and doing weird audio experiments, and there were strobe lights and flashing colors on the walls and stuff like that, and it was like a concert, it was like a party, and it seemed I'm sure they probably got some useful insights from both of those, but I think whatever I was reading kind of made the kind of a speculation that if they hadn't discovered yet the potential for using LSD perhaps as a social disruption agent in the youth culture, that perhaps that was their aha moment where they realized that if you melded this with a music scene and then you got everybody vibing and taking acid and listening to this crazy blues rock music, then that was kind of, that would really draw, that would be the real siren song and it kind of did. It drew everybody from around the country in 1967 and 68 to run away from home and migrate to San Francisco to the Haight-Ashbury to search this kind of new scene, this new thing that was happening. So maybe they did, maybe this was this is also around the time that a couple MK sub-projects that we really don't know anything about also got founded, MK Search, which I've always been fascinated by. As far as I know, I think all the documents for MK Search were destroyed, and we know very little about it. But we do know that it, unlike Monarch, we know that it existed as a program with money allocated to it. It was they at least had the records of it, and I think there was also maybe one called MK Often, and those I know MK Search, I believe, started in 1964. So. And then, presumably ended when the rest of them, or, went further underground when it all got exposed in 1973. But so what was MK Search doing for those 9 years? You know what I mean? I'm not saying necessarily this was the part where we bring it into the culture and set up cults and make rock bands, as Target Is Your Brain said, when the social crisis deepens, there's no time for democracy. And notice how suddenly hundreds of pop idols appear, their guitars calling you to the barricades, and that kind of thing happening. And it's they really did kind of happen. And the guitars did call everybody to the barricades. But then what was the end result? I mean, we saw basically the complete crushing of the American left, which had a lot of interesting and radical currents, and I don't know if I would say it was kind of ascendant, but there was definitely, I think, a potentiality there in the 60s for the sort of mainstream square Eisenhower culture that all these people were railing against and thought was whack. There was an opportunity maybe for that to be challenged and replaced with something that was like actually more politically and socially progressive, but unfortunately, all of the potential leaders of that got mysteriously assassinated by lone gunmen throughout the 60s. So, dang it. I guess we couldn't go that way.
I definitely don't think the Grateful Dead was... It's, like, shocking. I was saying before we started recording that it's really amazing that, like, during the time they had positioned themselves so strongly as, like, an apolitical band. Like, I feel like even... I mean, she definitely waffled around a little bit, but I feel like even Taylor Swift is political at this point, you know? So, like, to be an apolitical band, like, in the 60s and 70s, like, that's really a lot. One of the things that, again, like, I really didn't know anything about the Grateful Dead prior to, like, researching for this. Like, I just had, like, very little interest in, like, any of this. I hadn't really listened to their music. Like, I'm definitely not, like, definitely not a jam band type of person, but I was intrigued to find they had done an album called like Blues for Allah. Yeah, you know, I didn't like listen to it fully. I only listened to a little bit of it, but you know, it's very much like in that sort of vein of you know, Middle Eastern inspired kind of like atonal melodies. I guess like they claim that the title track of Blues for Allah was supposed to be a eulogy for King Faisal. But I kind of got the impression again.
Wait,
like,
King Faisal of Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, exactly. But that's like what they said. However, I did get the strong impression. There's another song where they also mentioned that was written by Hunter. I think that it was also Hunter who wrote Blues for Allah, and he wrote another song where he mentioned Allah, which is like "What's Become of the Baby," the title of that referring to like the Lewis Carroll poem, of course, you know, the psychedelic. It's all just like so cringe and incredibly lame. But anyway, yeah, like I like, you know, they say it's about King Faisal, and maybe it is because he was you know, obviously involved in Middle Eastern politics heavily at that time. But it almost seemed to me that this song and the other mention of Allah are like about like, or kind of like sort of maybe I'm just like, you know, jumping at shadows here, but I felt like these are kind of about Israel, and like, you know, if for instance they say like these
another
just, like, so
settler cowboy state.
It's so painful to even read. Well, you know, it's just like peace, man. You know, like so like Arabian Wind for one. Like just kill me with this stupid. You know, the needle's eye is thin. Ships of state sail on mirage and drown in sand. Out in no man's land, where Allah does command. What good is spilling blood? It will not grow a thing. Taste eternity. The sword sings blues for Allah, and the chorus is Inshallah. I just like, this is like worse than like Aladdin. Like literally, like this is worse than like the music from Aladdin.
Yeah,
like
that's pretty great.
It gets even worse. It's just like all these cringy like desert, like, you know, like Arabian Nights, like Orientalist cliches. You know, the one like What's Become of the Baby is really just as bad. Like you know, it seems also to be a reference to like the 6-Day War and stuff, and it came out like I think a couple years after that. But there's a line where he says like he refers to, you know, the lighting the polished ice caverns of Khan, where in the looking glass, you know, like referring to
Coleridge
Khan poem again, like stupid, lame, like, you know, cheesy,
freshman year
like,
shit, freshman year English 101 shit.
Where in the looking glass fields of illusion wander the child who was perfect as dawn. What's become of the baby this cold December morning? Racing rhythms of the sun, all the world revolves, captured in the eye of Odin. Allah, pray where are you now? All Muhammad's men blinded by the sparkling water. So I feel like that's about like, you know, about like the 6-Day War, you know, they're blind, you know, all Muhammad's men like couldn't win, you know. So like it's like, oh, we're apolitical, but we're taking like a stupid, annoying, uninformed stance on something that we have like no stake in whatsoever. Hunter, like at one point he got like really angry and had a huge fight with I guess
with
Weir.
Bob Weir.
Yeah, exactly. Over you know, how he wasn't saying the right words, and then he was, you know, he said to Barlow, you know, you can have him or whatever.
So basically, Barlow became
so
kind of they almost had their own, like, because they were the two main lead singers, usually more Garcia than Weir, but Hunter became kind of like the lyric, you know, the lyricist for Garcia, and J.P. Barlow kind of became the main lyricist for the Weir songs, and they occasionally overlap, but it's a very weird setup. Like that, there's very few bands that have like a setup like that.
A lyricist who's not in the band. That like when it took me a second to wrap my mind around that. Like when I you know, someone was telling me independently like about Barlow, and he's like, he was the lyricist for the Grateful Dead, and I was like, oh, you know, what instrument did he play in the band? You know, and like, because it's so bizarre that the Grateful Dead of all people, you know, it's like, we're just jamming, you know, like they would have like a separate lyricist they would consult with.
And Robert Hunter was a musician. Like he played in like bands with Jerry Garcia during their like bluegrass folk days. And I don't know if J.P. Barlow could play, but they kept adding people to the band too. They'd find like a groovy, you know, keyboardist or something, and just like you know, a woman who could sing background vocals, and they would just like bring them along and like bring them in a band. So it is kind of weird that maybe these guys just like had no interest in performing. It's just kind of bizarre, but it has a kind of like, given both of their backgrounds, I mean, it almost seems like there's something more going on. I don't know, like a weird handler thing. Like, here you go. Like, here, like, why would a band that's so all about being like
these
free
words that you
and
must
loose
say precisely, like, you know, like I'm gonna get heated and upset if you deviate from them in performance. It's very strange. Yeah,
kind of ritualistic in a way, like
exactly,
like an incantation.
Yeah, exactly. Like, or, you know, like, and all the sort of things that the band was into. I mean, again, like, there are larger cultural currents, you could point to that, but at the, you know, to really, I think, if it still is necessary at some level, which I feel like it really even shouldn't be, to prove like the embedment of this or the entanglement of this with the kind of experimentation that was going on in the intelligence community at the time, all of the same like themes that they were interested in are like focuses of the band. Like the power of like, you know, the cultivation of these new sort of musical technologies that they sort of innovated, like the whole idea of the wall of sound, like and the use of this and this, like, you know, very controlled environment, you know, the religious experience, psychedelics, the mind, like Nietzsche, you know, like these types of philosophies, engaging with them in an intellectual way, like the birth of tragedy, you know, like,
and of course, you know, let's not forget our the other Stanford adjacent guy and Esalen adjacent guy who, you know, pops in and out of all this is like Joseph Campbell, and I feel like a lot of like the sort of the myth making of the Grateful Dead and the drawing it syncs up very well with like, you know, Hero with Thousand Faces and the idea that they're like archetypal kind of heroic narratives that recur throughout history, and so we should try to tap into those because they have this kind of subliminal appeal, you know, to audiences. And it seems like they were, I can't remember if Robert Hunter like studied under Joseph Campbell or was ever friends with him, but I think he was very much kind of on that kind of tip philosophically.
Yeah. I think, definitely. I think that's the kind of like, again, like today, I don't think that people who work in anthropology, folklore, or anything like that, like really take Joseph Campbell very seriously. But obviously, like in these circles, like these types of understandings of this stuff, I mean, people don't take the birth of tragedy very seriously as an actual explanation of Greek drama. But there was definitely an interest, like, for these people, and the idea of ritual and like its power was something that you know, I think that both artists and people for both artistic purposes and for other purposes, people were interested in marshalling. And I think that you can definitely see that going. And there's just so many things that are just, again, it's like many of these situations where you have just like a glut or a surplus of circumstantial evidence, but there's just like so many conspicuous and bizarre things about the Grateful Dead. And in fact,
something that I noticed about Robert Hunter that was interesting. So he actually did the MK Ultra Stanford tests in 1962, and then shortly after that became for a little while a Scientologist.
Oh, cool.
And he's not even the only Scientologist to be in the Grateful Dead. There was also Tom Constantin, who was Hank Harrison says he was friends with in the early 60s before, who was I think he was like a classically trained pianist or something, but ended up in the Air Force as a computer programmer while he was like in the Grateful Dead, and was also had joined the Church of Scientology. So he, along with Pigpen, were the only two members of the Grateful Dead that didn't drop acid, because Scientology is very anti psychotropic drugs, and I guess like his abstention from dropping acid, the fact that he was like an active duty like Air Force guy, like doing computer. I think he was at Nellis Air Force Base, where a lot of the drone program today is now. That's in Las Vegas. And, he was like playing gigs for 2 years, 68 to 70 with the Grateful Dead, but he was also like a very devout Scientologist, which they didn't seem to have like a problem with so much, but it was more that Scientology prohibited him from doing acid that they didn't like. They seemed to be pretty cool with like L. Ron Hubbard in general, and I guess if Robert Hunter was like low key kind of into them, and of course Charles Manson, another big figure of this decade in this whole scene that pops in and out. He briefly got involved with Scientology when he was in prison in the early 60s, so there's some like weird kind of like mind control, maybe things happening there, but yeah, there's just so much going on. Do we want to just take a little break now?
Yeah,
we're a little past like 1:45. Then maybe we can talk about Tim Leary a little bit, who kind of intersects, and because I think his ideas that his weird stories about like working for the CIA are probably relevant to all this. Okay.
You were just tuning into a special presentation of The Warlocks of Palo Alto, The Grateful Dead as Mass Ritual, Part 1, Episode number 33 of Subliminal Jihad. Tune in next week for Part 2.